glow of fear he hadn't felt in years. The email was unsigned, the body of the message empty except for 3 cryptic words. They woke it. Attached was a single image, a grainy photograph of a jagged tear in the Antarctic ice, stretching for miles under a dim sun. The picture was marked with a timestamp and coordinates that matched the exact location of the Helios research station, abandoned after the mission had abruptly ended in disaster. Ethan's chest tightened as he clicked on a second attachment, an encrypted file labeled Specimen Zeta. His pulse quickened as he worked to unlock it, the algorithms flooding his screen with fragments of text, chemical analyses, fragmented DNA sequences, and ominous phrases like adaptive morphology and uncontrolled proliferation. It was as if someone had taken pieces of the classified files he had once glimpsed and thrown them into a blender. He leaned back, his mind spinning. Helios, the project that had ended his career, the one he had tried to forget. Officially, it had been a mission to study microbial life beneath Antarctica's oldest ice. Ethan had signed on as a junior biologist, drawn by the promise of discovering organisms that predated humanity. But it hadn't taken long for him to realize something was off. The classified briefings, the armed guards, the equipment meant for containment rather than exploration, it all pointed to something bigger than microbes. He had started asking questions. Too many questions. And then came the incident. The details had been buried under layers of government red tape, but he had seen enough. Security footage of a quarantine breach, glimpses of something slithering through the research station's sterile halls. His supervisors had dismissed him as paranoid, calling his suspicions baseless. By the time he leaked what little he knew to the press, NASA had already painted him as an unstable, disgruntled employee. The fallout left him jobless, friendless, and convinced that no one would ever believe the truth. Now, staring at the email, Ethan felt the weight of years of silence pressing down on him. Someone out there wanted him to see this, needed him to see this. He typed a reply, his fingers shaking. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" His message bounced back instantly. The account had been deactivated. Ethan's first instinct was to ignore it, to push the laptop away and bury himself in his routine of coffee and self-pity. But something gnawed at him, a voice in the back of his head reminding him of the flashes he'd seen in those stolen files. The intricate structure of an alien cell, the terrifying speed of its replication. He spent the rest of the night combing through the attachments, the flicker of the screen his only light. By dawn, he had pieced together a faint outline of what had happened since he left Helios. The station's equipment, it seemed, had remained operational long after the project's official termination. The data logs showed irregular energy spikes, seismic disturbances, and cryptic notes from someone who had stayed behind, recording their findings in bursts of barely coherent text. His stomach churned as he opened the final file, a map marked with the same coordinates as the photograph. The message was clear. Someone wanted him to go back, to finish what had been started. Ethan closed his laptop and stared at the sliver of pale light creeping through his blinds. The last time he'd ignored a warning like this, people had died. He had spent years trying to bury the guilt, but it clawed its way to the surface now, raw and unrelenting. By mid-morning, he was rifling through boxes, pulling out his old NASA badge, a battered satellite phone, and a notebook filled with half-forgotten ciphers. He didn't know who had sent the email or why they had chosen him, but he knew one thing. The answers were waiting in the frozen wasteland of the South Pole, and whatever was buried beneath the ice, it wasn't done with him yet. The icebreaker groaned as it pushed through the dense floes surrounding the Antarctic coastline. Ethan stood on the deck, clutching the cold steel railing as the bitter wind tore at his face. Ahead, the frozen expanse stretched endlessly under a dim, pale sky. He felt the weight of their destination looming over him, even though the Helios station was still days away by land. The research station's coordinates glared from the GPS unit in his hand, a beacon pulling him back into a nightmare he'd tried to escape. Behind him, Maria Delgado and Harris King unloaded crates of supplies from the cargo hold. Maria, a former Air Force pilot, moved with practiced efficiency, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. Harris, a survivalist with a wiry frame and a crooked grin, whistled tunelessly as he secured the ropes. Neither seemed to share Ethan's unease, though he hadn't told them everything yet. Dr. Anya Tormund emerged from below deck, her face pale but determined. She had been the hardest to convince, a virologist skeptical of Ethan's story, who only agreed to come after he showed her the data logs. Even now, she seemed more concerned with disproving him than preparing for what lay ahead. The journey to the station was grueling. Their snowcat crawled over jagged ice fields and through blinding storms, the cabin filled with the monotonous hum of the engine. Ethan spent the hours poring over the fragmented files he had retrieved, his unease growing with each passing mile. The notes spoke of rapid mutations, a life form adapting at an impossible rate. One phrase stood out, repeated in the margins of the documents like a mantra. It learns. When they finally reached the station, it was almost unrecognizable. The once pristine facility was battered and weathered, its walls encrusted with frost and streaked with rust. The main doors hung ajar, creaking in the wind. Inside, the air was frigid and stale, the fluorescent lights flickering dimly from a failing generator. Ethan's breath fogged as he stepped into the central corridor, his boots crunching on frost-covered tiles. The team moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The first room they entered was the mess hall, and it was clear something had gone terribly wrong. Tables were overturned, and trays of frozen food lay scattered across the floor. A dark, frozen smear trailed from the corner of the room into the hallway. Harris knelt to inspect it, his grin fading. "That's blood," he said quietly. Ethan's stomach churned as he followed the trail to the laboratory wing. The doors were sealed with emergency locks, but Maria's tools made short work of them. Inside, the air was heavier, tinged with a chemical tang. The walls were lined with broken glass tubes, their contents long evaporated, and the floor was littered with shredded biohazard suits. In the center of the room was the first body, or what was left of it. Anya recoiled, her hand over her mouth. The figure was barely recognizable as human, its torso split open, its rib cage splayed like the petals of a grotesque flower. Something had burst out from within, leaving behind a frozen mess of viscera and warped tissue. Ethan forced himself to look closer, noting the translucent patches of skin that shimmered faintly under the light. "This isn't decay," he said, his voice hoarse. its transformation. Anya crouched beside him, her scientific curiosity overriding her disgust. The cells, they're still active. This isn't just mutation, it's integration. Whatever this thing is, it's rewriting their biology. Maria's voice crackled over the radio from the adjacent room. You might want to see this. They found her in the communications center, where the walls were plastered with frantic notes written in marker. Words like containment breach, autonomous adaptation, and kill on sight leapt out from the chaotic scrawl. The last entry on the station's log was a garbled audio recording. Ethan pressed play, and the room filled with the sound of labored breathing, followed by a single desperate whisper. It's learning from us. If you're hearing this, run. The recording ended abruptly, and for a moment the only sound was the faint hum of the generator. Then a distant crash echoed through the station, followed by a low, guttural noise that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Harris unslung his rifle, his eyes narrowing. We're not alone. Ethan turned to the others, his voice shaking. We need to leave, now. But as they made their way back to the main corridor, they realized the station wasn't just damaged, it was changing. The walls were streaked with a strange organic growth, pale and fibrous, like veins crawling through the structure. The air grew heavier, tinged with a faint hum that seemed to come from all around them. They reached the main entrance only to find it blocked. The snowcat's headlights, visible through the cracked doors, were now dimmed by a layer of something translucent and pulsating, as if the ice itself was alive. Maria cursed under her breath, raising her weapon. What the hell is that? Before anyone could answer, a figure stepped into the light. At first glance, it looked human, a man in a tattered parka. But as it moved closer, its head lolled at an unnatural angle, and its arms bent in ways no bone should allow. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a smile, its teeth bared in a rictus grin that stretched too wide. It lunged. The corridor erupted into chaos as Maria fired, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The figure collapsed, its body spasming, but even as it lay still, its flesh began to writhe, tendrils sprouting from the wounds like worms seeking fresh air. Ethan pulled Maria back as Harris emptied his magazine into the thing, shouting curses with each shot. Anya grabbed Ethan's arm, her voice panicked. We need to get to the server room. If there's a chance of finding out what this thing is... Ethan nodded, his mind racing. Whatever this was, it wasn't just an escape, it was a hunt, and they were the prey. The station felt more alive with every passing moment, its groaning metal frame echoing like a living, breathing organism. The alien growths that had begun to spread through the walls now pulsed faintly, synchronized with an unearthly hum that seemed to vibrate in Ethan's chest. The air had thickened, carrying a metallic tang that burned his throat with each breath. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe, as if the station itself was watching, waiting. Ethan led the way down a narrow corridor toward the server room, Maria close behind, her weapon raised and eyes darting in every direction. Harris brought up the rear, muttering to himself as he reloaded his rifle, while Anya carried a medical kit and the laptop she had salvaged from the lab. Their collective tension was palpable, a fragile thread ready to snap at the slightest provocation. When they reached the server room, the door was ajar, its frame warped as though it had been forced open by something immense. Inside the once sterile space was a chaotic tangle of wires, smashed monitors, and gelatinous patches of alien tissue clinging to the walls. The servers themselves were intact, but the alien growth had begun to entwine with the machinery, fusing organic and synthetic in grotesque harmony. "This isn't just spreading," Anya said, her voice a mix of awe and dread. "It's assimilating." Ethan sat at the central terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he navigated through corrupted files and fragmented logs. With each recovered document, the horrifying truth came into sharper focus. The entity NASA had unearthed wasn't a dormant organism. It was a hive intelligence, a life form designed not just to survive but to conquer. It could mimic, adapt, and evolve at an unprecedented rate, using its hosts as raw material for new iterations. "What does that mean for us?" Maria asked, her voice tight. Ethan hesitated. "It means it's learning from us, our biology, our tools, even our behavior. It's using everything it encounters to make itself stronger." The words hung heavy in the air as a low rumble shook the station. The lights flickered, and a wet, slithering noise echoed from somewhere deep within the facility. Harris raised his weapon, his hands trembling. "Something's coming," he growled. Ethan barely had time to register the movement before Harris rolled over, clutching his stomach. His face contorted in pain as he let out a guttural scream, his rifle clattering to the floor. Anya rushed to his side, but she froze as Harris's body began to convulse violently. His skin bubbled and stretched, veins glowing faintly beneath the surface. He clawed at his chest, his eyes wild with terror. "It's inside me," he gasped before collapsing to his knees. Maria grabbed Anya and pulled her back as Harris's body twisted unnaturally. His spine arched, and his limbs elongated with sickening cracks. His skin split in places, revealing patches of slick, translucent flesh, writhing with tendrils. When he raised his head, his face was no longer entirely human. His eyes burned with a cold, alien light, and his mouth twisted into an inhuman snarl. "Harris, stop!" Ethan shouted, though he knew the man he had known was already gone. Harris, or what he had become, lunged toward them with inhuman speed. Maria fired, her bullets ripping into his mutated form, but the wounds only seemed to fuel its transformation. Tendrils sprouted from the injuries, whipping through the air as it advanced. Ethan grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and slammed it into the creature's head, buying them a brief window to escape. "Run!" Maria shouted, firing another volley as she backed toward the door. They fled down the corridor, the walls closing in as the alien growths thickened around them. Harris's monstrous screams echoed behind them, joined by the wet, slithering sounds of something larger moving through the station. By the time they reached the medical wing, Ethan's lungs were burning and Anya was on the verge of collapse. "This thing isn't just infecting us, it's reshaping us," Anya said between gasps. She gestured to Ethan's arm, where translucent patches of skin were spreading like a rash. "You're already changing." Ethan looked down at his arm in horror. The alien growth was more advanced now, his veins pulsing with a faint bioluminescent glow. His fingers trembled as he clenched his fist, trying to suppress the growing sensation of something writhing beneath his skin. "There has to be a way to stop it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Anya nodded, though her expression betrayed her doubt. The logs mentioned heat and acid as potential containment measures. If we can find a way to destabilize its structure... A deafening crash interrupted her, followed by the sound of metal tearing. The creature that had once been Harris burst into the room, its form now even more grotesque. Limbs extended and twisted into claw-like appendages, and its torso had split open, revealing a pulsating core that glowed with an unnatural light. Maria threw a grenade, the explosion shaking the room and filling it with smoke and debris. When the dust settled, the creature was gone, but the walls around them had begun to shift, the alien growths pulsating faster. "We're running out of time," Ethan said, his voice grim. "It's not just us. It's the station. The whole structure is becoming part of it." Anya's eyes widened as realization dawned. If it fully integrates with the station's systems, it could reach the outside world. Maria grabbed Ethan's shoulder, her face set with determination. "Then we destroy the station. All of it." Ethan hesitated, torn between the desperate hope of finding a cure and the harsh reality of their situation. But as the hum of the alien organism grew louder, he knew there was no other choice. Their only hope was to sever the infection at its source, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The cavern opened before them like the mouth of some ancient, primordial beast, its icy walls glistening with the pulsating glow of alien veins. The air was suffocatingly warm, the heat radiating from the grotesque biomechanical structures that had fused with the rock and ice. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped into the chamber, his boots crunching on a layer of frost that gave way to something slick and wet beneath. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the hive. Maria followed close behind, her rifle clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Her face was pale, streaked with blood and grime, but her eyes burned with a fierce determination. Anya's absence hung heavy between them, a silent reminder of the price they had already paid. Ethan could still hear her screams echoing in his mind, the sound abruptly silenced when the creature had dragged her into the darkness. The core of the hive loomed ahead, a pulsating mass of shifting, translucent tissue. Tendrils snaked outward, connecting it to the surrounding walls like arteries feeding a living organism. The closer they got, the more Ethan could feel it. An oppressive presence pressing against his mind, its intent alien and unfathomable. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, the alien glow from his infected arm casting faint shadows on the walls. Maria stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal him. She pointed toward the hive's center, where something massive shifted within the pulsating mass. Ethan squinted, his stomach churning as he realized what he was looking at. The entity was no longer just a singular organism. It had absorbed its hosts, their twisted forms fused into its structure. Limbs jutted out at grotesque angles, faces frozen in expressions of agony and rage. And at its center, an enormous eye opened, its iris a swirling kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to pierce straight through him. "It knows we're here," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum. Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. He pulled the satchel of explosives from his pack, his hands trembling as he began arming the charges. The plan was simple. Plant the explosives around the core, set a timer, and get as far away as possible before detonation. But as he worked, A chilling realization crept over him. "We're not going to make it out," he said, quietly, not looking up. Maria glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Don't say that." "You know it's true," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "Even if we destroy this thing, the infection, it's already in us. It's in me." He held up his arm, the translucent patches now spreading to his shoulder. "If we leave, we risk spreading it." Maria stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. "Then we finish this here." Ethan swallowed hard and returned to his task. The seconds stretched into eternity as he moved from one side of the chamber to the other, placing the charges and double-checking the connections. Maria covered him, her rifle trained on the shifting mass at the hive's center. The tendrils seemed to sense their presence, writhing and extending toward them, but the creature hesitated, as if studying them. When the final charge was set, Ethan stood and turned to Maria. "The detonator has a manual override," he said. "Someone needs to stay behind to make sure it goes off." Maria opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan cut her off. "It has to be me. I'm already infected. If I leave, this thing wins." Maria's hands tightened on her rifle, her jaw set in defiance. "You can't do this alone." Ethan smiled faintly, a trace of the man he used to be breaking through. "I think I already have." Before she could respond, the hive let out a deafening roar, the sound vibrating through their bones. The tendrils lashed out, striking the walls and ceiling, causing chunks of ice to crash to the ground. The eye at the core swiveled toward them, its gaze filled with malice. The creature was no longer waiting. It was attacking. "Go!" Ethan shouted, shoving Maria toward the exit. "Get out of here!" Maria hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned and ran, her footsteps echoing as she disappeared into the tunnel. Ethan watched her go, a lump rising in his throat. He turned back to the hive, his hands tightening around the detonator. The creature's tendrils surged toward him, but he didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his infected arm glowing brighter as the alien presence within him resonated with the hive. "I'm not afraid of you," Ethan said, his voice steady. The hive shuddered, the faces within it contorting in rage and despair. Ethan pressed the override button, activating the countdown. The tendrils closed in, wrapping around his legs and torso, pulling him toward the core. He didn't fight. He let them take him, his final act one of defiance. The last thing he saw was Maria's silhouette in the distance, a faint speck of humanity against the vast, frozen wasteland. He closed his eyes as the timer reached 0. The explosion ripped through the cavern, a deafening roar that shook the earth and sent shockwaves across the icy landscape. Maria stumbled and fell, the heat from the blast searing her skin even from miles away. She turned back, tears streaming down her face as she watched the ground collapse, the hive buried beneath a mountain of ice and fire. For a moment there was silence. Then the alien hum faded, leaving only the howling wind. Maria knelt in the snow, her body trembling. She reached for the satellite uplink in her pack, her fingers numb as she typed out a final message to NASA. "Containment achieved. No survivors. Do not send another team. Burn everything." She sent the message and collapsed onto her back, staring up at the endless expanse of white. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her vision blurring. As the infection began to take hold, she whispered a silent prayer that this would be enough, Far beneath the ice, something pulsed faintly, the glow dimming but never extinguishing. The wind carried Maria's final breath across the desolate expanse, a fragile whisper swallowed by the void. And then there was nothing. Dr. Eliza Moore had always found comfort in the quiet hum of the observatory, a refuge from the chaos of the world below. Tonight was no different. Sitting at her console, she sifted through the endless data streams from the Hubble Space Telescope. The Kuiper Belt had been her focus for years, a silent frontier of frozen rocks and dwarf planets on the edge of the solar system. But as the screen flickered with a new set of images, Eliza froze. There was something there, a shadow among the stars, so faint it was almost imperceptible. At first, she assumed it was an error, a smudge on the lens, or a processing glitch. But the readings confirmed it. An object, vast and dark, drifting silently in the outer reaches of the solar system. Its albedo was nearly zero, swallowing light as if it refused to exist under observation. She leaned closer, heart pounding. The object didn't fit any known classification. It was larger than Pluto, its orbit erratic, almost as if it were alive. She felt a chill run down her spine, but dismissed it as excitement. A discovery like this could reshape the way humanity understood the cosmos. Over the next few days, Eliza delved into the Anomaly. The object, designated XJ9812 by NASA's automated system, seemed to emit faint pulses of energy. The signals were barely detectable, but they followed a pattern, almost like a heartbeat. It was unlike anything she had encountered. As the hours stretched into days, she found herself consumed by the data. The signals weren't just rhythmic, they were layered, complex, almost deliberate. Her colleagues began to notice her obsession. "You've been staring at that thing for 3 days straight," said Marcus, a fellow astronomer and one of her few friends at the lab. "Take a break, Eliza. It's probably just a rogue asteroid." "It's not an asteroid," she snapped, then immediately regretted her tone. She softened her voice. "There's something purposeful about it, Marcus. You'd see it too if you looked closer." Marcus sighed, but agreed to help her analyze the data. Together they uncovered something even more unnerving. The pulses weren't just energy emissions. They seemed to interfere with their instruments, causing minor but inexplicable glitches. And it wasn't just the machines. After long hours of studying the object, Eliza began experiencing migraines, sharp, stabbing pains behind her eyes that came without warning. She didn't tell Marcus, though she noticed him rubbing his temples more often as well. By the end of the week, the signals had become an open secret among the team. Others in the lab reported feeling uneasy, though no one could explain why. A tense atmosphere settled over the observatory, and arguments broke out over minor issues. When one of the senior astrophysicists shoved an intern during a heated discussion, NASA's leadership intervened. The incident was swept under the rug, but the message was clear. Something was wrong, and it was spreading. Despite the growing unease, Eliza couldn't stop. The object occupied her every waking thought, and even her dreams weren't safe. She dreamed of dark, twisting shapes, spiraling endlessly, a sensation like sinking into a cold abyss. When she woke, she would find herself scratching at her arms, her skin red and raw. One night, as she worked alone, a new transmission arrived from the telescope. It was a high-resolution image of XJ9812, and it took her breath away. The object's surface wasn't smooth like she had assumed. It was uneven, textured, almost organic. Faint ridges and grooves spread across it, forming patterns that seemed unnervingly familiar, like the fractals she had seen in her dreams. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the image as a wave of nausea washed over her. The object wasn't just a rock. It was something alive, something ancient. Her rational mind struggled to process it, but deep down she knew the truth. XJ9812 wasn't an anomaly to be studied. It was a presence, and it was waking up. The next morning, Eliza presented her findings to the department. She expected skepticism, maybe even ridicule. Instead, she was met with silence. The room was filled with pale faces and tired eyes, her colleagues already worn down by the same unseen weight she carried. "We need to report this," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't a natural phenomenon. It's something else." The director of the lab, a stern man named Dr. Caldwell, shook his head. "We don't have enough evidence to make that kind of claim, Moore. If this gets out without verification, it'll be a disaster." "But the signals," she began, but he cut her off. "Are inconclusive," he said firmly. "Continue your analysis, but keep this contained. No leaks, no speculation." Eliza left the meeting feeling defeated but not deterred. If the higher-ups wouldn't act, she would. That night, she downloaded all the data she had on XJ9812 and sent it to an old mentor who worked at an independent observatory. If nothing else, she needed someone else to see what she saw, to confirm she wasn't losing her mind. But deep down, she feared it was already too late. The data from the observatory continued to pour in, filling Eliza's workstation with streams of numbers, patterns, and distorted images. The object, XJ9812, was alive in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. The rhythmic pulses of energy it emitted grew stronger by the day, expanding their reach. Instruments around the lab began malfunctioning more frequently. Minor glitches at first, but soon entire systems went offline without explanation. It was as if the object's signals were reaching into the heart of their technology, corrupting it from within. But it wasn't just the machines that were affected. The lab itself felt different, as though a heavy, oppressive force had settled over everyone inside. Conversations were clipped, tempers short. A quiet hysteria simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but palpable. Eliza noticed it in the way people moved. Furtive glances, hurried steps, hands trembling as they typed on keyboards. The migraines that had plagued her since the discovery of XJ9812 were now constant. Pain flared behind her eyes, sharp and unrelenting. She'd taken to wearing sunglasses even indoors, shielding herself from the harsh glow of the monitors. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought nightmares, visions of twisting black veins stretching across her skin, her body breaking apart and reforming into something alien. And then there were the whispers. Faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, like wind brushing through leaves. She thought she was imagining them until Marcus mentioned hearing them too. "You hear it, don't you?" he asked one evening, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. They were alone in the observation room, the hum of machinery their only company. "Hear what?" she replied, though she already knew. The noise, he said, gesturing vaguely. It's not the equipment, it's... He stopped, running a hand through his hair. It's like it's in my head. Eliza didn't respond. She didn't need to. The same sound had been haunting her, soft, rhythmic, like a distant chant. It grew louder when she focused on the object's signals, as though it were calling to her. NASA launched a probe to investigate XJ9812, a sleek vessel equipped with state-of-the-art instruments. As it approached the object, the signals intensified, disrupting communications with the probe. The last images it sent back before going dark were blurred and distorted, but one frame stood out. A mass of what looked like organic material covering part of the object's surface. It was knotted and grotesque, its texture resembling the flesh of some unknown creature. The team's biologists analyzed the image, but their conclusions only deepened the mystery. The structure was neither mineral nor metallic. It bore the hallmarks of biology, but its composition defied categorization. Eliza stared at the image for hours, unable to shake the feeling that the entity was watching her in return. The signals weren't just affecting those in the lab. Reports began trickling in from around the world. Pilots claimed their instruments failed mid-flight, causing near collisions. Radio operators heard strange interference, a low, thrumming noise that seemed to resonate in their bones. Even ordinary civilians reported an unexplainable sense of unease, as though something enormous and ancient was stirring just beyond their perception. Eliza spent hours poring over these accounts, trying to find a pattern. She began noticing correlations. People exposed to the signals for prolonged periods exhibited the same symptoms as those in the lab: headaches, irritability, and, in some cases, violent outbursts. The signals weren't just noise, they were intrusive, invasive, like a virus worming its way into the human mind. One night, as she worked late, Eliza's computer screen flickered and went black. She cursed under her breath, assuming another malfunction, but then the screen lit up again. Lines of code scrolled across it, though she hadn't initiated any processes. At first it seemed random, but as she watched, the characters began to form shapes, spirals and fractals, the same patterns she'd seen in her nightmares. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, intending to record the phenomenon. Before she could, the patterns dissolved, replaced by a single message in bold text. "We are awake." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She blinked and the message was gone, the screen back to its usual diagnostic display. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity, heart hammering in her chest. She told no one about the incident, fearing they would think she was losing her mind. Perhaps she was. The next morning, a meeting was called. The signals had begun affecting global communications on a massive scale. Satellites malfunctioned, broadcasts were interrupted, and networks collapsed in cascading failures. The lab received an encrypted message from NASA's upper echelons. The object was now classified as a national security threat. All research on XJ9812 was to be halted immediately. But Eliza couldn't stop. She knew the signals were more than just interference. They were a message, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Whatever it was, humanity wasn't prepared for what lay ahead. The object wasn't just sending signals into space. It was reaching into Earth itself, into the minds of everyone who dared to listen, and it was only getting stronger. The decision to send a manned mission to XJ-9812 was met with resistance, not just from within NASA, but across the global scientific community. Yet, the growing instability on Earth made the choice inevitable. Riots were breaking out in major cities. Entire populations reported mass hallucinations and violent outbursts. The signals from XJ-9812 were spreading, their effects seeping through every corner of human civilization. Leaders hoped that a direct study of the entity might offer answers, or a way to stop the chaos. Dr. Eliza Moore, despite her worsening condition, was chosen to lead the mission. Her familiarity with the object made her invaluable, though she hid the full extent of her symptoms. She wasn't alone in her secrecy. Each member of the 6-person crew carried their own scars, physical or mental, inflicted by the signals during the months of preparation. Yet, like Eliza, they pushed forward, driven by duty, curiosity, or desperation. The spacecraft Odysseus launched into the silent void, a sleek metallic shell carrying the weight of humanity's last hopes. As they neared XJ-9812, the ship's systems began to falter. Instruments flickered erratically, guidance controls responded sluggishly, and the ever-present hum of the object's signals grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the vessel. When XJ-9812 finally came into view, the crew fell silent. The images from the probes hadn't prepared them for the sheer enormity of the entity. It loomed before them, an irregular pulsating mass of blackened tissue, its surface covered in jagged ridges and deep fissures exhaling plumes of vapor. The patterns across its surface seemed to shift when observed, forming shapes that defied logic and burned into the mind. "Is it breathing?" whispered Commander Rhea Lawson, the pilot. No one answered. The ship's automated systems struggled to find a stable orbit, the entity's erratic gravitational field throwing calculations into disarray. Eventually, they landed on a relatively flat section of the surface, though landed felt like a misnomer. The entity's surface wasn't solid. It flexed beneath their feet, organic and unyielding. The first steps outside the ship were tentative. Their boots sank slightly into the pliant, membrane-like ground, which oozed a viscous, dark substance when pressed. The air outside was technically unbreathable, but their suit filters detected trace elements of ammonia, methane, and something unidentifiable. The combination left an acrid taste in their mouths, even through their oxygen supplies. Eliza led the way, a handheld scanner in one hand, a growing sense of dread in her chest. As they ventured deeper, the terrain became more surreal. Massive, spine-like structures jutted into the black sky, some vibrating with a low-frequency hum that resonated in their chests. Pools of bioluminescent liquid dotted the landscape, their glow casting eerie shadows that moved as though alive. The signals were stronger here, no longer just a sound but a presence. Eliza felt it pressing against her skull, probing her thoughts. She gritted her teeth and pushed forward. They had a mission to complete. Dr. Hassan, the biologist, stopped suddenly. "Look at this," he said, crouching beside a fissure. Inside was a writhing mass of tendrils, thin and translucent, like veins pumping fluid through the organism. As he reached out to collect a sample, one of the tendrils shot out, wrapping around his gloved hand. He screamed, jerking back, but the damage was already done. His glove had melted away, and the skin beneath was blistering, black veins spreading from the point of contact. They hurried back to the ship, but Hassan's condition deteriorated rapidly. His arms swelled and darkened, the veins pulsing as though something was moving beneath the surface. His screams turned guttural, his words incoherent. Within hours, his entire body twisted into a grotesque shape, his limbs elongating unnaturally, his skin splitting open to reveal patches of the same chitinous material they had seen on the entity's surface. By the end of the transformation, he was no longer human. The rest of the crew watched in horror as Hassan's new form convulsed, then stilled. The silence didn't last long. Moments later, his body twitched and began to move again, but it wasn't him anymore. The creature turned its eyeless face toward them, emitting a deep, guttural sound that echoed the signals from the entity. It lunged. In the chaos that followed, they barely escaped back to the ship. 2 crew members were injured, their suits torn, and Eliza knew it was only a matter of time before they succumbed to the same fate as Hassan. The spores, if that's what they were, had already begun their work. She could see it in the way their hands shook, their eyes darting nervously, and the dark patches spreading beneath their skin. Desperation set in. They needed answers, something to justify the horrors they had endured. Eliza decided to press on, alone if necessary. She ventured deeper into the entity, following the faint glow of its bioluminescent veins. The signals grew deafening, a cacophony inside her skull, but she pushed through, determined to find the source. At last, she reached the core, a massive, pulsating chamber lined with organic structures that resembled nerves and blood vessels. In the center was the source of the signals, a throbbing gelatinous mass that seemed to ripple with energy. Eliza realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't just a dormant organism. It was awake, aware, and hungry. She raised her scanner, recording everything, but the signals surged, overwhelming her. She fell to her knees, clutching her head as visions flooded her mind. Planets consumed, civilizations torn apart, their inhabitants twisted into grotesque extensions of this living nightmare. She understood now. The entity wasn't just alive. It was a predator, and Earth was its next prey. Her calm crackled with static, and she heard the panicked voices of her remaining crew. They were succumbing one by one, their screams echoing in her ears. Eliza forced herself to stand, her body trembling. She had to warn Earth. She had to stop this. Staggering back to the ship, she sent one final message to NASA. Destroy it, at all costs. As she collapsed onto the surface of the entity, her body convulsed, the spores taking hold. Her last coherent thought was of Earth, her home, and the knowledge that humanity would never be the same. Then, darkness consumed her. The transmission came through fragmented, distorted by the signals that had consumed everything near XJ9812. Yet, Eliza's voice cut through the interference, raw and desperate. Destroy it, at all costs. Back on Earth, the NASA control room fell silent as the message repeated itself, garbled and uneven, before cutting out entirely. The mission was lost. There would be no rescue. Eliza and the crew of Odysseus were gone, swallowed by the very thing they had been sent to understand. But the true horror was just beginning. The signals didn't stop. In fact, they grew stronger, radiating outward in waves that seemed to ripple through the atmosphere itself. Telecommunication networks failed en masse. Planes fell from the skies as instruments malfunctioned. Power grids flickered and died. And in the midst of the chaos, humanity began to change. At first, it was subtle, a collective unease that spread like a fever. People became irritable, then violent. Reports flooded in of individuals attacking friends, family, and strangers without provocation. Entire neighborhoods burned as riots consumed cities. The violence wasn't random, though. It followed the same rhythm as the signals, a pulse that seemed to sync with the beating of human hearts. In rural Montana, a farmer awoke to find his wife standing over him, her eyes blank and unseeing, her hands blackened and elongated, the flesh beneath her skin shifting unnaturally. She didn't speak, only screamed, a sound that wasn't hers but something else, something alien. In Tokyo, a commuter train derailed after the conductor began clawing at his face, screaming about voices in his head. In Paris, a mother walked into the Seine with her child, both smiling serenely as their skin dissolved into black veins that spread like roots in the water. The spores had arrived. Though no one could prove it, the scientific community quietly accepted that the spores had traveled with the signals, carried invisibly through airwaves, through electromagnetic frequencies, through the very infrastructure that connected the world. The signals were no longer coming from XJ9812 alone. The entity had infected the Earth itself. Eliza's mentor, Dr. Randall Greaves, was one of the last to understand the full extent of what was happening. He had been analyzing her final data when the first symptoms appeared: trembling hands, a splitting headache, the same fractal patterns she had described surfacing on his forearms. He locked himself in his lab, determined to find a way to stop it. But the truth was already clear. There was no stopping it. The spores didn't just change the body, they rewired the mind, turning people into conduits for the entity's will. As the days stretched into weeks, Earth became unrecognizable. Cities were overrun by twisted forms, half human, half something else. Their limbs elongated, their flesh hardened into chitinous armor, and their eyes were replaced by dark, empty sockets that seemed to absorb the light around them. They didn't just kill, they built. Across the planet, grotesque towers of flesh and bone rose from the ruins, pulsing with the same rhythmic hum as XJ9812. They were not merely monuments, but extensions of the entity, growing and spreading as if the planet itself were becoming part of it. Among the chaos, a few survivors clung to their humanity. Small groups hid in the shadows, avoiding the infected and the ever-present sound of the signals. One such group, a family of 4 huddled in an abandoned subway station, listened to the distant hum as they shared their last can of food. The father whispered stories to his children, trying to drown out the sound, but even he could feel it now. A low vibration in his bones, a pulse in his skull, urging him to let go, to join the collective. Above ground, the towers continued to grow. In the center of what had once been New York City, the largest of them all pulsed with life. Its spires reached the clouds, and at its base was a single massive opening. From within, a low, droning sound emanated, a sound that echoed across the world. It was a summons, a call to the remnants of humanity. Those who heard it felt an irresistible pull, their bodies moving of their own accord toward the monolith. In his final moments, Dr. Greaves recorded one last video, his face gaunt, his eyes bloodshot. This is not just evolution, he whispered, his voice trembling. It's assimilation. We were never meant to understand it, never meant to resist. XJ9 Eta-12. It's not a planet, it's a seed. And Earth is its soil. As he spoke, the black veins spread up his neck, his voice dissolving into a guttural growl. The recording ended abruptly, leaving only static. Above the planet, XJ9812 loomed closer, its massive form casting Earth in shadow. The entity had completed its first phase. The once vibrant blue and green of Earth's surface was now a patchwork of black and red. Its oceans turned to thick, viscous sludge, its skies choked with spores. Humanity was no longer the dominant species. It wasn't even human anymore. And yet, the entity wasn't finished. Its signals reached farther now, beyond Earth, into the cold expanse of space. Somewhere another world turned its gaze towards the faint, rhythmic hum coming from the stars, unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. In the silent void, XJ9812 pulsed with satisfaction. It was awake, and it was hungry. Ethan Caldwell adjusted the straps of his pack, the chill biting through his layered clothing as he ascended the western Sea du Bois. The wind howled like a living thing, whipping ice particles against his goggles and leaving his exposed skin raw. His boots crunched over the frozen ground, each step deliberate, his breathing steady but labored in the thin air. He had prepared for years for this climb, dreaming of Everest's summit since his childhood. But now the dream felt hollow, weighed down by the ghosts of his past, failures that had haunted him since his last expedition ended in tragedy. The mountain was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual hum of climbers and guides. Ethan had deliberately chosen the off-season, seeking the solitude he believed would help him reconcile with his doubts. Yet the stillness unnerved him. It wasn't just the absence of other humans. It was something deeper, an oppressive presence that seemed to lurk in the shadows of the ice walls. Midway through his climb that day, Ethan paused to check his GPS and replenish his energy with a protein bar. He scanned the landscape, the pristine white broken only by jagged rocks jutting from the snow. Then a glint caught his eye, a metallic sheen barely visible beneath the snowpack to his right. Curiosity tugged at him. He trudged over, his ice axe clinking against his gear as he knelt down to brush the snow away. At first he thought it was an old piece of equipment left behind by a previous expedition, but the surface was smooth and unmarred by time. As he cleared more of the snow, his breath caught. It wasn't just a stray object, it was a hatch, circular and sealed tight, with the faded remnants of a NASA logo stamped onto its surface. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, his voice muffled by his scarf. The sight was so out of place it made him second-guess his eyes. What was a NASA installation doing on Everest, buried beneath ice and snow? His pulse quickened, the thrill of discovery outweighing his wariness. The hatch was frozen solid, its edges sealed by decades of ice. Ethan worked tirelessly, chipping away with his axe until his muscles screamed in protest. The sound of cracking ice echoed through the valley. With one final heave, the hatch creaked open, releasing a rush of stale air that made him gag. A narrow, icy shaft descended into darkness. Ethan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to leave it alone. But something deeper pushed him forward, the need to know, to see. He clipped his harness to a nearby anchor, securing a rope before descending into the abyss. His headlamp illuminated frost-covered walls as he lowered himself into the shaft, the faint hum of machinery startling in the otherwise lifeless quiet. The shaft opened into a corridor, its walls lined with metal and frost. Ethan landed on a grated floor, the sound of his boots echoing unnaturally loud in the confined space. The air here was heavy, stale, and tinged with an unfamiliar metallic tang. He swept his headlamp across the corridor, revealing doors sealed tight and signs marked with cryptic designations like Laboratory A and Data Center. Ethan pressed forward, his breath visible in the freezing air. The place looked abandoned, but not in the way of long-forgotten ruins. It was as though the people here had vanished suddenly, leaving their workstations and equipment untouched. Old monitors sat frozen beneath layers of frost, their screens shattered or dark. Papers, brittle and yellowed with age, were scattered across the floor. He found a control room with a single terminal still faintly glowing. The screen flickered to life as he brushed against it, displaying strings of code and a login prompt. Above the terminal, a plaque bore the words, Project Ether. Ethan's hands trembled as he wiped the frost from the desk, uncovering a folder with a NASA emblem embossed on its cover. Flipping through its contents, he found dense technical jargon, maps of the mountain's subsurface, and something that made his stomach drop. A diagram of a containment pod labeled Subject 47P. The notes described it as an organism of unknown origin, extracted from deep beneath the Earth's crust. Ethan's eyes scanned the pages, the words blurring together. Rapid adaptation, environmental manipulation, anomalous behavior. He turned at a sudden noise, a distant creak, like metal groaning under strain. The sound reverberated through the corridors, sending a shiver down his spine. His light danced across the walls, but nothing moved. Still, the unease coiled tighter in his chest. He decided to leave, to return to the surface and report his discovery. But as he retraced his steps, the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, unfamiliar turns branching where there had been none before. The air felt heavier now, and his head throbbed with a dull ache. Something about this place was wrong, deeply, inexorably wrong. Finally, he reached the shaft and began his ascent, the cold biting harder than before. As he emerged into the open air, he gasped, the mountain's brutal winds striking him with renewed force. For a moment he thought he saw movement in the snow near the hatch, a flicker too quick to identify. He shook his head, blaming exhaustion and the thin air. Ethan resealed the hatch and marked its location on his GPS. Whatever he had stumbled upon wasn't meant to be found. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that leaving it buried was no longer an option. Something had been disturbed, something ancient and incomprehensible. As he climbed higher, the hatch seemed to call to him, its image burned into his mind. He could still feel the heavy air of the corridors in his lungs, the faint hum of forgotten machines buzzing in his ears, and worse, a nagging sense that he hadn't left the base entirely behind. The base was far larger than Ethan had initially realized. The hatch had been just the tip of a vast subterranean structure that extended deep into the heart of the mountain. Ethan's unease grew with each step as he explored the labyrinthine corridors. The walls were lined with frost-covered panels, their surfaces glinting faintly in the beam of his headlamp. His footsteps echoed eerily, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. Ethan pushed open a heavy metal door that groaned in protest, revealing what appeared to be a research lab. The room was in disarray, with shattered glass littering the floor and equipment strewn about as if the occupants had fled in a panic. The air here was different, thick with a chemical stench that made his throat burn. He moved cautiously, his eyes scanning every shadow for signs of movement. The lab was filled with rows of equipment he couldn't identify, their functions inscrutable. On a cluttered table, he found a series of binders labeled with cryptic titles: Geothermal Microbial Study, Primordial Adaptation Reports, and Containment Protocols. His gloved hands trembled as he opened one of the binders. The notes inside described experiments conducted on microbial life forms extracted from deep within the Earth's crust. These organisms, referred to as primordials, were unlike anything previously discovered. Ethan read with mounting dread as the notes detailed the organism's ability to adapt rapidly to their environment, forming complex, self-sustaining networks. Initial tests suggested they could thrive in extreme conditions, from searing heat to freezing cold, making them ideal for potential applications in climate stabilization. As he flipped through the pages, the tone of the entries changed. The scientists had grown increasingly alarmed as the primordials began to exhibit unpredictable behavior. They weren't just adapting, they were evolving, merging into larger, more complex structures. The organisms began spreading beyond their containment units, infiltrating the base's infrastructure. Tendrils of organic matter were found growing inside electrical conduits and air ducts, their pulsating forms impossible to destroy without causing further spread. Ethan set the binder down, his stomach twisting in knots. On the wall opposite the table, he noticed a large containment pod, its glass surface cracked and frosted over. The label Subject 47P was emblazoned on its side, matching the diagram he'd seen earlier. Inside, the remnants of some organic mass clung to the walls, its dark, slimy texture shimmering under the light. Whatever had been inside was no longer there. The monitors near the pod flickered to life as Ethan approached, displaying video logs of the experiments. The footage was grainy but clear enough to show the scientists' initial excitement as they observed the organisms under controlled conditions. Their enthusiasm turned to fear as the primordials began exhibiting parasitic tendencies. The logs showed researchers succumbing to infection, their bodies convulsing as tendrils burrowed beneath their skin. Ethan gagged as the camera zoomed in on one of the infected. The scientist's veins bulged unnaturally, black and pulsating, as though something was moving inside them. The footage ended abruptly, replaced by static, and a final recorded message from the base's lead researcher. "We thought we could control it," the voice said, trembling with desperation. We were wrong. The organisms are aware. They respond to stimuli. They adapt faster than we can predict. They've breached containment. We've initiated lockdown, but it's too late. If you're hearing this, do not attempt to study them. Do not let them leave the base. The screen went dark, leaving Ethan standing in stunned silence. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had seen. This was more than a scientific disaster. It was a horror beyond comprehension. These creatures weren't just dangerous. They were a threat to life itself. A sudden noise jolted him from his thoughts, a faint, wet, slithering sound echoing from the corridor outside. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned off his headlamp, plunging the room into darkness save for the faint glow of the monitors. The sound grew louder, closer. Something was moving out there. He reached for his ice axe, gripping it tightly as he crept towards the door. Peering into the corridor, he saw nothing but shadows stretching endlessly in both directions. Yet the sound persisted, a low, rhythmic squelching that sent shivers down his spine. He closed the door quietly, his breaths shallow and quick. Ethan knew he couldn't stay in the lab. He needed to find a way out of the base, to escape before whatever was out there found him. But the deeper he ventured, the more he realized that the base wasn't just abandoned, it was alive. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, and strange web-like growths clung to the corners of the ceiling. The tendrils were translucent, their insides writhing with movement. He passed another room, the door ajar. Inside, he saw a chair with leather restraints, its occupant reduced to a pile of bones and withered flesh. The skeleton's ribcage was shattered outward, as though something had burst from within. Ethan staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He pushed forward, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to climb out of this nightmare. But something drew him deeper, an inexplicable pull that he couldn't resist. The corridors seemed to shift as he walked, the base's layout defying logic. His GPS was useless, the signal scrambled by the mountain's interference, or something worse. At last he found himself in a vast chamber, its walls lined with more containment pods. Most were shattered, their contents long gone. In the center of the room stood a massive console, its screens displaying a single warning message. Containment breached. Evacuate immediately. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the discovery crushing him. This wasn't just a lost NASA experiment. It was a Pandora's box that had been opened, unleashing something that could never be contained again. Whatever had been unleashed here wasn't dead. It was still somewhere in the base, and it was evolving. Ethan stumbled through the corridor, the oppressive weight of the air suffocating him as he moved deeper into the labyrinth. His head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that worsened with every step. The slithering noise he'd heard earlier was gone now, replaced by an eerie stillness that only heightened his unease. The faint glow of his headlamp barely penetrated the darkness, casting flickering shadows that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. The corridors twisted unnaturally, each turn disorienting him further. He tried to retrace his steps, but the path back to the hatch was no longer recognizable. It was as if the base itself was changing, reshaping to trap him. The walls bore strange, pulsating growths, fleshy, web-like tendrils that oozed a viscous black substance. Ethan avoided touching them, but their presence seemed to creep closer with every passing minute. Then he heard it again, a sound that froze him in place. A low, guttural growl, followed by the wet squelch of something moving. It came from behind him, distant but unmistakable. Ethan turned, his breath catching in his throat. The corridor stretched into darkness, but the sound grew louder, closer. He gripped his ice axe tightly, the metal cold and reassuring in his gloved hand. His heart pounded as he backed away slowly, his headlamp sweeping the shadows. He strained his ears, every nerve on edge, as the sound stopped abruptly. The silence was worse. It felt alive, coiled and waiting. And then it attacked. The creature lunged from the shadows with terrifying speed, its form a grotesque amalgamation of sinew, bone, and writhing tendrils. Its head, or what passed for one, was elongated, with a jagged, tooth-lined maw that snapped inches from Ethan's face. Black, glistening tendrils sprouted from its back, writhing and probing the air like living whips. Its body was a patchwork of organic and alien textures, pulsating with a sickening rhythm. Ethan barely had time to react. He swung his axe instinctively, the blade glancing off the creature's hardened carapace with a metallic screech. The impact jarred his arm, but the blow bought him a moment to scramble backward. The creature hissed, a guttural sound that resonated deep in his chest, and lunged again. This time, Ethan dove to the side, the creature's tendrils whipping past him and slamming into the wall. The force cracked the metal paneling, sending shards flying. Ethan crawled to his feet, his legs trembling as he sprinted down the corridor. The creature gave chase, its heavy clawed limbs pounding against the floor in a relentless rhythm. Ethan's mind raced as he ran. The base wasn't just a trap, it was a feeding ground. The thing pursuing him wasn't just hunting, it was protecting its territory. The growths on the walls, the shifting corridors, it was all part of the same organism. The base and the creature were connected, parts of a single horrific whole. He turned a corner and nearly tripped over a pile of debris. His headlamp illuminated the remains of a containment pod, its glass shattered and its interior coated with black resinous material. Scattered around it were human bones, stripped clean and twisted into unnatural angles. Ethan gagged, bile rising in his throat, but he kept moving. Ahead he saw a door marked Main Control Room. He threw himself against it, the door groaning as it slid open just enough for him to slip through. Inside, the room was filled with more monitors and control panels, their screens flickering with static and error messages. The air here was noxious, heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something alive. He locked the door behind him, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The pounding in his head intensified, and his vision blurred for a moment. He wiped sweat from his brow, only to find his glove slick with something dark and viscous. He pulled his hand back in horror, realizing it wasn't sweat. It was the same black substance that coated the walls. The wounds on his arm, from where the creature's tendrils had grazed him, were oozing the same fluid. "God, no!" he muttered, panic surging through him. The infection was spreading, his body betraying him with every passing second. He grabbed a piece of cloth from his pack, wrapping it tightly around the wound in a desperate attempt to slow the process. A loud crash jolted him back to the present. The creature was at the door, its claws raking against the metal with deafening screeches. The tendrils squeezed through the gaps, probing and writhing as they searched for him. Ethan looked around frantically, his eyes falling on a control panel that appeared more intact than the others. He rushed to it, the screens flickering to life as he tapped at the keys. The interface was outdated but functional, displaying a map of the base and a series of status indicators. One of the options read, System Purge, Initiate Lockdown. Ethan's fingers hovered over the command. It was his only chance to stop the creature, and whatever else might be lurking in the base, from escaping. The door buckled under the creature's assault, the metal bending inward. Ethan pressed the command, the terminal beeping in response. A countdown appeared on the screen. Purge sequence activated. T-minus 10 minutes to lockdown. The room trembled as the base began its self-destruct sequence, the walls groaning and lights flickering. The creature roared, its tendrils tearing through the door as it forced its way inside. Ethan grabbed his axe, his muscles screaming in protest as he swung wildly. The blade connected with one of the tendrils, severing it in a spray of black ichor. The creature shrieked, recoiling for a moment before surging forward again. Ethan retreated, his back against the console as he prepared for the end. But as the countdown ticked closer to 0, the base shuddered violently, a deafening roar echoing through the corridors. The ceiling began to collapse, chunks of metal and ice crashing down. The creature let out one final piercing screech before it was buried under the debris. Ethan barely managed to dive beneath a console as the room caved in around him. Darkness consumed him, the world reduced to silence and the faint rhythmic pulsing of something alive deep within the mountain. Ethan awoke to darkness. His body ached with every shallow breath, his ribs straining against the crushing weight of debris. He struggled to move, disoriented and cold, his mind clouded with fragments of memories. The creature, the countdown, the collapse. The faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere in the distance, accompanied by an unnatural hum that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. He forced himself to move, clawing through the rubble, pinning him down. Each shift of his weight sent searing pain through his infected arm, the black tendrils beneath his skin writhing in protest. When he finally freed himself, his headlamp flickered weakly, casting faint light on the wreckage around him. The control room was in ruins. Shattered monitors hung from the walls, cables dangled like entrails, and the floor was littered with fragments of steel and frost-coated glass. Yet somehow the room still felt alive. The walls pulsed faintly, the organic growths that had infested the base now spreading unchecked, their web-like tendrils throbbing with eerie rhythm. Ethan staggered to his feet, gripping his ice axe for balance. His body was failing him, his infected arm was nearly useless, the tendrils now extending to his chest and neck, their dark veins pulsing just beneath the surface of his skin. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, against the alien presence that seemed to be taking control of him. The terminal he had used to initiate the purge flickered faintly amidst the debris, its screen cracked but still functional. The countdown had stalled, frozen at 000001. A sickening realization settled over him. The system purge had failed. Whatever force controlled the base, whatever intelligence the primordials possessed, had stopped it. The base wasn't just alive, it was fighting back. A guttural roar echoed through the corridor outside, shaking the walls. The creature wasn't dead. Ethan's blood ran cold as the sound grew louder, accompanied by the wet squelch of tendrils dragging across metal. The thing had survived the collapse, its hunger unrelenting. Ethan turned to the terminal, desperation taking hold. If the automated purge sequence wouldn't work, he would have to finish the job manually. He scanned the map of the base, now distorted and riddled with errors, and located the reactor core buried in the lowest levels. A manual override there would trigger a full meltdown, destroying the base and everything in it, including him. The thought should have terrified him, but it brought a grim sense of clarity instead. There was no escaping the infection coursing through his veins, no undoing the horrors he had witnessed. All he could do now was ensure that whatever monstrosity had been unleashed here never reached the outside world. Summoning every ounce of strength, Ethan began his descent. The corridors were unrecognizable now, overrun with alien growths. The walls pulsed with a sickly bioluminescent glow, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something metallic, like blood and rust. As he moved, the base itself seemed to resist him. Tendrils sprouted from the walls and floors, reaching for him like living traps. He hacked at them with his axe, black ichor spraying as the severed appendages twitched and writhed. The infection in his arm burned hotter with each strike, the tendrils beneath his skin reacting violently to the creature's proximity. He reached the reactor core after what felt like an eternity. The massive chamber was bathed in a dim, red light, its walls vibrating with the steady hum of machinery. The core itself stood in the center, a towering structure of metal and glass that pulsed with energy. It was surrounded by more of the alien growths, their tendrils wrapped around its surface like parasites feeding on a host. Ethan approached the control panel, his legs trembling beneath him. The override required a manual input code, one he had seen scrawled in the logs he had recovered earlier. He punched it in with shaking fingers, each keystroke a monumental effort. As he activated the override, an ear-splitting roar filled the chamber. The creature emerged from the shadows, its massive form illuminated by the glow of the reactor. It was even more grotesque now, its body fused with the alien growths that had infested the base. Tendrils sprouted from every surface, writhing and snapping as it charged at him. Ethan turned to face it, his axe raised. He knew he couldn't fight it, not really, but he could buy himself enough time to finish what he'd started. The creature lunged and he dodged, the tendrils grazing his side and ripping through his jacket. Pain shot through his body as the infection flared, but he pressed on, leading the creature away from the panel. The reactor's countdown began, its automated voice echoing through the chamber. T-minus 60 seconds to detonation. The creature roared again, its movements frantic as if sensing its impending doom. Ethan used the last of his strength to climb onto a platform above the core, drawing the creature's attention. It leapt after him, its tendrils ripping through the metal supports as it closed the distance. Ethan turned to face it, his breath ragged. He could feel the infection overtaking him, his vision darkening as the alien presence consumed his mind. But he held on to one thought, one singular purpose. With a final defiant scream, he threw himself at the creature, driving his axe deep into its head. The reactor detonated. The explosion ripped through the base, obliterating everything in an instant. The mountain trembled as a massive plume of fire and smoke erupted from the slopes, lighting up the night sky. The alien growths were incinerated, their tendrils curling and disintegrating in the inferno. The creature was gone, reduced to ash. In the aftermath, the mountain fell silent once more, its slopes scarred but still standing. The hatch was buried beneath tons of rubble, sealing the horrors of the base forever. Or so it seemed. Weeks later, in a remote Himalayan village, strange reports began to surface. Locals spoke of glowing tendrils spotted near a frozen stream, their movements almost serpentine. Livestock went missing, their carcasses found days later, stripped clean and covered in black, oozing slime. And in the shadows of Everest, the mountain seemed to pulse faintly, as though something deep within its core had begun to stir once more.